friends, welcome back to my channel. This is Cruel Intentions, a true crime channel. I am Holly, and with every video I take you on a journey throughout Australian true crime history. If you are interested in Australian true crime and you enjoy an occasional change of backdrop and scenery, then consider subscribing. Or don't. I'm not here to tell you what to do, I'm not your real mum, and I never will be. So I know that I said that my schedule was going to be more regular, and I promise you it will be, but for the last couple of weeks I've been rehearsing for a show. When I'm not researching and writing true crime stories, I train at an aerial studio, so if you want to see what I mean, you can check out my Instagram at Cruel Intentions channel. Yes, that was a shameless plug. Today, however, we're talking about 17-year-old Gabriel Gabe Meyer, who was dropped off by his father to the local gym on the afternoon of Tuesday the 12th of January 1993 in Innisfail in North Queensland. His father saw him greet the friend he was meeting there and walk into the gym, and his family would never see him alive again. They contacted police and made a missing persons report. They spoke to his friends. They scoured the local area and places that he usually hung out, but no trace could be found of where Gabe might have gone. The investigation into Gabe's disappearance would take many turns, including searching crocodile-infested waters, rainforests, and local farms, and would end up pointing to a person the family knew very well, Gabe's older sister's ex-boyfriend, Damon Frank Calanca. Damon seemed to have all the answers to the investigators' questions. He had an alibi, he had witnesses to support his movements, and he seemed to have a really good relationship with the Meyer family. But detectives still felt like he was hiding something. There were factors that would make him the prime suspect. Calls and letters to Gabe's sister in America, kilometers on a vehicle that couldn't be explained, as well as his previous criminal record. Now, just a warning, towards the end of this case there will be some pretty heavy themes of homophobia. Obviously not on my part. I am an ally, always have been and always will be, but this was the early 90s when LGBTQIA+ panic was still in full devastating effect. But without further ado, let's get into it. Now, the Meyer family were originally from Miami, but Doug and Sherrie Meyer had decided to leave their home in the United States and move their family to the small, quiet town of Innisfail on the cassowary coast of far north Queensland. Incidentally, they had actually made this move because they were concerned about the growing crime rate in their hometown. Gabriel, or Gabe Meyer, was the second oldest of the 6 Meyer children. Born in Miami, Florida, but relocating with his parents to Innisfail, he was polite, friendly, a loving and caring young man. His parents described him as a mature and responsible teenager, a kid who never gave his family or parents any trouble. His friends described his family life as great. He had a close relationship with both of his parents and his siblings. There was never any indication of trouble at home. And everyone who knew Gabe knew that he was fun-loving but sensible and reliable and just an all-round really good guy. It was late on the afternoon of Tuesday the 12th of January 1993 when Gabe got a lift with his dad Doug to go to the local gym for a workout. He and his sister Fawn had frequented the gym and had made some friends there. Doug watched Gabe get out of the car and stopped to chat with a mate of his, Damon Calanca, before they both headed inside. Doug thought nothing of this. He knew Damon. Damon had spent time with their family and had dated his eldest daughter, Fawn, for a few weeks before she had left to America the previous year to start a university course. Calanca had even spent the past Christmas with them, sharing in their Christmas lunch and celebrating with their family. Doug returned home from dropping Gabe off, and he and Sherrie, along with their 4 other children, enjoyed a relatively normal afternoon at home. It was at about 7:30 p.m. that Sherrie and Doug started to worry that Gabe had still not come home from the gym. His workouts usually didn't take that long, and he would never just take off without letting them know. He never missed dinner if he could help it, and he always let them know if something had come up. They even went so far as to call the local hospital just to check if Gabe hadn't gotten into some sort of accident. but the hospital staff confirmed that he had never been there. Sherrie told herself and her husband that they were probably being silly. They trusted and respected their son. Gabe was 17 after all. He probably had just met up with some mates. Maybe he'd gone to a movie or to get some dinner somewhere, or was just hanging out at a mate's place. He was a responsible kid. He never got into any trouble, and surely he would be home soon enough. But as the evening wore on, they still hadn't heard anything from Gabe, and he still had not come home. Worry and panic started to set in for Doug and Sherrie Meyer. They had tried to get some rest, hoping that Gabe might just be staying at a friend's house, but they both still felt like he would have called. Sherrie kept getting up to go and check Gabe's room to see if he had made it home, but every time his room and his bed were empty. It was at about 4:30 a.m. the following morning that Sherrie and Doug Meyer knew with every parental instinct they had that something was terribly wrong. Even if Gabe had stayed somewhere else that night, he would have contacted them, and he hadn't. Something had happened to their son, and they were going to try and find out what it was. They got up and they started to make a plan for what they could do. The first thing that Doug suggested was to go and visit Damon Calanca. Gabe had met up with him at the gym the previous afternoon, so he would at least know what time Gabe left, maybe even where he was going afterwards or who he might have been with. When they arrived at the set of flats where Damon Calanca lived and walked up the stairs, they noticed that his door was already open. Calanca came to the door when they called out, and Doug asked him if he knew where Gabe was. They told him that Gabe had not come home the previous night, and they were worried, and they wanted to know if Calanca had seen him. Damon Calanca told them that, yeah, he had. After Gabe had finished at the gym, he'd come back to Calanca's flat and hung out for a while until it started to get dark. They'd read some magazines, they'd hung out with Calanca's flatmates, they'd had a protein shake, and at about 5:30 p.m, Gabe said that he was heading down to the pontoon to go for an evening swim. Alarm bells started to ring for Doug and Sherrie Meyer, because the place that Gabe allegedly went off for a swim was the Johnstone River, which was notoriously filled with crocodiles who swam and lived all throughout that waterway. The Meyer family knew all about the danger of crocs in the river. It was a rule of thumb not to swim there, particularly when it was dark, and it had been raining the previous evening. It would have been the worst possible time for Gabriel Meyer to have gone for a swim. Doug and Sherrie wouldn't believe that their son, who did admittedly love the water, but who knew about these dangers, would have chosen to go swimming at night in the rain in crocodile-infested waters. Sherrie and Doug spoke to a couple of Gabe's other friends, but no one had seen him and no one knew where he was. Doug decided at that point that he needed to inform the police that his son was missing. He dropped Sherrie off to look after the other 4 Meyer children, all who were worried for their brother, and headed to the local Innisfail police station with 2 of Gabe's friends. Senior Constable Christy Malone took the missing persons details from Doug, who told her that this was highly unusual behaviour for Gabe, and that he'd never disappeared or run off before. The friends of Gabe's that Doug had brought with him were questioned about their thoughts on Gabe's movements. Both of his friends thought it was very strange that Gabe would go swimming in that river at night in the rain. It just wasn't something that he would do. They also confirmed that he had never expressed any intention or desire to get away from his family, and he'd never indicated that he was having any trouble at home at all, and he definitely wouldn't have just picked up and left. It seemed to officers that this was not the case of a 17-year-old choosing not to come home, maybe staying overnight somewhere or going to a party. It seemed to be totally out of character for Gabe to have left and to not have told anyone where he was going. If Gabe had indeed gone swimming in the Johnstone River, then there was a chance that crocodiles were the reason that Gabe had never made it home that night. Acting Senior Sergeant Derek Pickless led the investigation into Gabe's disappearance, along with Detective Senior Sergeant Mick Jacobs. They started by tracing Gabe's known movements the previous day. They needed to speak to everyone that Gabe might have been in contact with that day, or anyone that might have seen him from the time that he was dropped off at the gym. A few of the gym's members remembered seeing Gabriel there in the afternoon and recalled that he had left at about 4:30 p.m. Damon Calanca confirmed that Gabe had come over to his place after that. They had hung out in the flat for an hour or so, and then Gabe had announced that he was going off to the pontoon to swim. That was the last time Calanca said that he or his flatmates had seen Gabriel Meyer. Pickless and Jacobs needed to verify that Gabe had actually made it to the river to go swimming. There was concern among the officers that if he had gone to the river, then there was a strong likelihood that he may have either drowned or been attacked by a crocodile. Being dark and also raining would have been perfect conditions for a crocodile attack, and would also mean that it would have been very possible or even likely that Gabe could have gotten lost or he may have even drowned. The officers knew that when crocodiles attack and take prey, they will most often store what they haven't eaten somewhere else. This is because crocodiles have evolved to only require a small amount of food to survive for long periods of time. In fact, crocodile stomachs are only about the size of a basketball, so while they hunt and attack large prey, they are unable to consume much at a time. The well-known death roll of a crocodile is used to be able to rip and tear smaller chunks of flesh from prey that they can then consume whole. Because while crocodiles' teeth are perfect for hunting and biting through skin, flesh, and bone, they have no molars, so therefore they're unable to actually properly chew food. For this reason, crocodiles will usually eat what they need to and then store remaining food either underwater underneath submerged logs, in small caves with underwater entrances, or in the roots of mangroves. They are then able to return to the food when they need to, and as the prey breaks down and starts to rot, it becomes easier for the crocodile to break it down into smaller pieces. Innisfail police officers were fairly sure that if Gabriel had been taken by a crocodile in the Johnstone River, that they would find remains somewhere in the dense mangroves along the river bank. With the assistance of local fisheries and wildlife departments, as well as crocodile experts in the area, searches were made along the Johnstone River to see if any trace of Gabe could be found, if there were any signs that he'd been attacked. They found nothing in their initial search that would indicate that Gabe had been attacked. Now, this didn't completely rule out the possibility, but it had now been 36 hours since Gabe had last been seen, and police knew, as most of us do, that the first 48 hours of any missing persons investigation is the most crucial, and they needed something else to go on. They revisited the possibility that Gabe had simply run away. He was not a small child. He was old enough to have made that decision. But after again speaking to his friends and family, there was nothing to suggest that he would have wanted to leave. He also had nothing on him that afternoon but his workout gear and a small bag. Officers accessed and traced his bank account records, and it showed that he hadn't touched his accounts either. If he had left, he hadn't used any money to do so, and hadn't spent any money in the couple of days since he'd last been seen. They investigated the local public transport options and spoke to the local bus company, the Queensland Rail Department, local airlines, and local and interstate coach services. But every company confirmed that Gabe had not used any of them. He hadn't left by any means of public transport that had been available to him. Things weren't adding up for police, and they could only now classify Gabe as missing under suspicious circumstances. On Thursday the 14th of January, Doug and Sherrie Meyer filmed a plea for television for any news about their son. They asked for anyone who had any information to come forward and ended with a message to Gabe. Quote, "Just give us a call. We love you, Gabriel. We love him so much and all the kids miss him and we just want to know that he's safe." Police knew that the last person who had seen Gabriel was Damon Calanca. When Doug had gone to Damon's flat the previous morning, he told Doug Meyer to tell the police to feel free to come and ask him any questions. He said that the police in that small town knew where he lived, and if they wanted to come and talk to him, he would tell them everything that he knew. Officers went to Damon Calanca's apartment and asked if he would consent to going down to the police station with them for an interview so that they could get the exact timeline of where Gabe had been. Calanca went with them willingly. They started the interview by getting some background on how Damon Calanca had known Gabriel Meyer. 26-year-old Calanca told them that he had been dating Gabe's older sister, 19-year-old Fawn Meyer, for a few weeks before Fawn had left to go back to Miami. He told them that he'd gotten quite close to the Meyer family in that short time, but that he'd only really known Gabe through working out at the same gym. Fawn had also attended that gym, and Calanca had started at first just saying hello to her in passing, but he was instantly attracted to her and began to compliment her every chance that he got. She remembers that at that time he was really nice to her. He was really friendly, he was quite charming, and she had agreed to start dating him. She did make it clear, though, that in only 3 weeks after they were to begin their relationship, that she would be leaving to go to America for university. Calanca was devastated, but he was resigned to spending as much time as he could with the girl that he'd fallen in love with before they would be separated. Doug and Sherrie could see that Calanca was heartbroken about the fact that Fawn would be leaving so soon, and so encouraged her to invite him over for Christmas and to spend some time with the family. Calanca told the officers that he and the Meyers were very close and that he was like family to them, but he only knew Gabe through the gym. He was then questioned about the last time he'd seen Gabe. He told them the same thing that he'd told Doug and Sherrie, that after the gym, Gabe had come back to his flat where they'd hung out, they'd read magazines, they'd had some protein shakes, and then Gabe had left, saying that he was off for a swim. They then wanted to know what Calanca's movements had been for the rest of the evening. He told them that his flatmates had gone out to see a movie, but that he'd promised to go and drop off a large piece of carpet to his sister's place in Tully, about 40 to 45 minutes away. He'd organised to hire a ute for the evening and had picked it up before 7 p.m, and then he'd loaded the carpet into it. Before he'd left, he dropped his neighbour at the local hotel to cash his paycheck and then dropped the neighbour back home before he'd started to head towards his sister's house. But on the way, it had started to rain. He'd been unable to fit the carpet in the front of the vehicle, and so it had been sitting in the tray uncovered, and he didn't want it getting damaged by the rain. So he'd made the decision to turn around instead of continuing on. He said that the carpet was now back in his garage at his flat. He'd stopped near a bridge and turned around, and he'd headed back home, and he'd got back at about 9 p.m. Shortly after he'd come home, his flatmates went to bed. It had stopped raining by this point, and Calanca thought that he might go down and do some nighttime fishing. He left again in the hired vehicle and stopped at a local store to buy a torch, but before he could get to his preferred fishing spot, it had started to rain again, so he gave up this plan of going fishing and he again went back home. The officers decided to go and have a look at the large piece of carpet, and when they did, they noticed how old, stained, frayed, and basically gross it was. It was laid out flat on the garage floor and was in such poor condition that officers were immediately questioning why he would have been travelling so far to give it to his sister instead of throwing it away. Pickless commented that he would never have thought about giving anything that old and worn to any of his family members. Police decided to take possession of the carpet, especially considering that some of the stains present on it visually looked like they could be blood, and so they wanted to run some preliminary tests. The Queensland Police Forensic Services Coordinator, Senior Sergeant Artie Law, used sanguine sticks to test the carpet. When they're rubbed on a suspicious stain and then moistened, the strips can turn from their original white colour to orange if there is a possible presence of blood, and in high concentrations of blood, the strips will continue to change colour until they are a vivid green-blue. The test strip used on this carpet, however, showed no reaction. Police were still suspicious of Calanca. He'd been the last person to see Gabriel. He had claimed that Gabe had gone swimming in crocodile-infested waters at night in the rain, which made no sense to anyone that knew him. He had claimed to be driving an old, dirty, frayed bit of carpet to his sister's for no apparent reason, and he was currently on probation after being arrested in December of 1991, only 14 months earlier. It was this prior arrest that interested police now. They were starting to fear the worst for Gabriel, and back in 1991, Damon Calanca, a 25-year-old divorced father of one manager at a fast food restaurant, had been arrested for attempted murder. They decided to call back to duty the arresting and charging officer from the case, Sergeant Kerry Benstead. They gave Benstead a rundown of the disappearance of Gabriel Meyer and then told him that the last person who had seen him was Damon Frank Calanca. Benstead told the officers everything he knew about the arrest of Calanca in December of 91 and how he had come to be charged with attempted murder. On the night of the 14th of December that year, a man named Paul Mellick wandered up to a farmer's door near Flying Fish Point, about 10 minutes out of Innisfail, and called for help. His back was soaked in blood. He had a knife in his hand, and he'd been stabbed in the back. Paul Mellick had done nothing wrong and had not hurt or offended Calanca in any way, except that at that time, he was dating Damon Calanca's ex-girlfriend, Fiona Way. Fiona had actually dated Mellick before, and they'd broken up. She entered into a short relationship with Calanca, but had realised when she'd been with him that she still had feelings for her ex-boyfriend. So she broke up with Damon Calanca to get back together with Paul Mellick. What the police would come to realise in time is that Calanca was both obsessive and possessive of the women that he dated. When he found out that his Fiona was back with her ex, his "if I can't have you, no one can" mentality took over, and he decided that he wanted her back, even though she'd been the one to leave, so that really wasn't his call to make. He invited Mellick out for a drive on the pretense of wanting to speak to him about Fiona. He just wanted to, make sure that Mellick was treating her right and wanted to clear the air between them. Mellick, for some reason, agreed to go for a drive with Calanca. Maybe he thought that if he went and spoke with him that he'd finally leave them alone, or maybe he had a few choice words of his own for Calanca. But whatever the reason, he got into Damon Calanca's car and they headed off towards Flying Fish Point. Calanca lectured Mellick about the proper treatment of his ex-girlfriend, apparently only trying to give him hints and tips on how to keep her happy. He stopped the car once to talk with Mellick more, and then he stopped the car a second time. They both got out of the vehicle at this point. Now, the legal records state that Calanca had produced a knife shortly before they had stopped for this second time. The record says that Calanca claimed that the knife was not taken out in any threatening way, but it was to be used to clean his toenails, which he commenced doing once they had stopped and exited the vehicle. And I know this is a true crime channel and I talk about some pretty messed up stuff, but a toe knife? Seriously? Like Frank from Always Sunny?
With toe knife.
With what now?
With a toe knife. Because I use a sharp blade to dig the scum out of my toenails.
Ugh, gross. Anyway, after Calanca had used his toe knife, both men headed back towards where the car was parked. Paul Mellick had had enough of this adventure and of the lecture that he was getting from his girlfriend's ex. He told Calanca to take him home. He was done. As Paul Mellick was getting into the car, however, he felt a sharp pain. Damon Calanca had made his way over to the passenger side of the vehicle and had stabbed Paul Mellick in the back. Mellick's fight response kicked in automatically and the two began to fight next to the vehicle. Miraculously, Melich managed to wrestle the knife away from Damon Calanca, and once he had it, he started to run. As he ran, he heard the car start up behind him. Calanca had jumped back in the driver's seat and was chasing him through the grass. He heard the car speed up and looked over his shoulder to see Calanca getting dangerously close. Before Calanca could run him down, Melich dove into some long grass on the farmland that they were on, and Damon Calanca missed hitting him by only a foot, or about 30 centimeters. Calanca claimed that far from trying to run him over, he'd only been trying to catch up with Melich so that he could graciously offer him a lift home. Calanca was arrested and charged with attempted murder, but police had a problem. They couldn't prove that Damon had intended to kill Melich or that he'd taken the knife with him for that purpose, the only witnesses to the event being Calanca and Melich themselves. Calanca claimed that his actions and the attack of Paul Melich that night had been on the spur of the moment, and his only motivation was to make sure that his Fiona was taken care of properly. Because Calanca had a good work history and no prior convictions for any violent offences or otherwise, he got away with what was effectively a slap on the wrist. He pled down to 1 count of unlawful wounding and 1 count of dangerous driving. He received a sentence of 200 hours of community service and was ordered to be on probation for 2 years. Now, the Attorney General's Department of Queensland and Melich's family actually appealed the sentence in October of 1992, hoping to have a custodial sentence imposed. Basically, they thought that he should serve some time in prison for what he had done. Calanca claimed that he had only attacked Melich because he was afraid that Melich was about to attack him, and he was just trying to defend himself. But there was absolutely no evidence that that was true. The court documents even state that there had been no provocation by Melich at any time that might have caused Calanca to think that he was in any danger. Calanca had the weapon, he had the vehicle, and he was in control of the situation. Unfortunately, this appeal against sentence was dismissed by the Queensland Court of Appeals, and Calanca walked away with some community service and a 2-year term of probation. So he was effectively a free man after attempting to kill the boyfriend of his ex-girlfriend. She had left him and he wanted her back, and he was willing to do anything he needed to make that happen. He was willing to get rid of any obstacles in his way to get what he wanted, including killing a man. And then he met Fawn Meyer. Now, Fawn had actually read about this incident in the local newspaper, and before she and Damon had started dating, he and a friend of his had approached her and asked her if she knew about what had happened. She told them that she knew of the case, but that she didn't know all of the details. Damon and this friend managed to convince Fawn that really it was just a case of a love triangle gone wrong, that it was just a big misunderstanding, an accident. After all, if it had been something serious, Damon would have gotten jail time, but he was only convicted of unlawful wounding and dangerous driving. They both told her that the newspapers and media had blown the whole thing out of proportion and not to believe everything she read. 19-year-old Fawn chose to believe that the charming, friendly, sociable Calanca was telling the truth, and so they began what would be a very short-lived relationship. Fawn and Gabe's parents, Doug and Sherrie Meyer, weren't thrilled with Fawn's new love interest. He wasn't their idea of a good choice for her, but she was 19, she was an adult, and they respected her decisions. They didn't feel like they were in any position to determine who she was and was not allowed to go on dates with. They remember Calanca being extremely intense about his relationship with Fawn, and while he was kind and attentive and charming, they had only recently met and had only been dating a week or so, and he acted like they were going to get married and be together forever. It struck Sherrie and Doug as odd that he would feel that way about a girl that he'd only just started dating. They were worried for Fawn, but they knew that she was about to head back to Miami for school, so they decided to let the relationship run its course without interfering, knowing that it would have to end soon. Damon again was devastated that Fawn was leaving after they'd only just gotten together. He begged her to stay in Australia with him, but she'd had her heart set on attending university in America and had been planning the trip for a long time, and had been accepted into a 3-year course she wanted to complete, so for her it was out of the question. She had told him before they'd even started dating that this was her plan, but when the date started approaching that she would have to leave, he became increasingly adamant that she should at least think about staying. She told him that there was nothing he could do to get her to stay. She'd made up her mind. She was going, and he was just going to have to accept that. When Fawn did eventually arrive back in Miami, she was bombarded by calls and letters from Calanca. He would call her non-stop, and at one point she was receiving 2 letters a day from the obsessive young man that she'd only spent 3 weeks with. The letters became increasingly dramatic, Calanca telling Fawn that she should come back home where she belongs, and that he was desperately in love with her, offering to pay for her flight home, and telling her that he would do absolutely anything for the woman he loved, that he missed her so much it hurt, and that he would keep calling and writing until she got rid of him. She did not reciprocate these feelings and tried to explain to Calanca that she really wasn't that interested in continuing their relationship. Damon Calanca was incessant. He was not picking up the hint that Fawn didn't want to be involved with him, that she was starting her new life in America, and that he wasn't a part of it. Her parents could see that there was a problem developing. Fawn had called them and told them about the constant calls and letters that she had been receiving, and they advised her to end it once and for all and to make sure that he got the picture, make sure that he knew it was over. When he called Fawn again on the 5th of January, she told him point blank that it was over, that she was done. She was not coming back to Australia. She told him to stop calling and stop writing to her. Calanca finally seemed to have gotten the picture. The calls and letters stopped, and Fawn was finally able to focus on building her new life in Miami. That was until just over a week later when Fawn received a phone call from her mother. Sherrie had called Fawn to let her know that her brother, Gabe, was missing, that he had never come home the night before. Sherrie then told her that the last person to have seen him was Damon Calanca. Fawn was immediately hit with a sense of dread. She recalled a conversation that she'd had with Damon Calanca a few weeks earlier before she had left for America, when he had been asking her to think about staying and not going back to Miami. She had told him there was really nothing that he could do or say that would make her change her mind, that she would be going for 3 years and she didn't intend to come back, unless, of course, something happened to her family. That would really be the only thing that would bring Fawn back to Australia. And now her brother was missing without a trace. Detectives and investigating officers' suspicion of Damon Calanca only grew when they received this particular bit of information. Not only this, but the fact that he had attacked Paul Mellick with a knife because he wanted to get his ex-girlfriend back. Obviously, the guy was not above hurting someone if it meant that he got what he wanted, and what he wanted in both cases was a woman. While police still had to keep an open mind and continue to class Gabe as a missing person, they began to suspect that something sinister had happened to the 17-year-old, and they were sure that if that was the case, then they needed to look closer into Damon Calanca, who may have done something to Gabe in an effort to force Fawn to come back to Queensland. Police had already seized the carpet that Calanca had claimed to be moving on the night of Gabe's disappearance, but nothing had linked it to Gabe in any way, so they decided to look closer into Calanca's movements that night. He had already told them that he'd hired the ute that evening at around 7 p.m. to be able to transport the carpet. The police officers seized the vehicle and also spoke to the hire company about Damon Calanca. The company told police that Damon had actually hired the ute for the following evening, Wednesday the 13th of January, but that late in the afternoon, early evening of the 12th, he had changed his mind, moving the booking forward and picking it up at 7 p.m. that night instead. The officers then accessed the hire company records. They wanted to be able to confirm Calanca's story about heading to his sister's place and turning back when it started to rain. According to the car hire records, the ute had travelled about 119 kilometres, or around 74 miles, in the time that Calanca had possession of it. Officers decided that they would trace the route that Calanca had claimed he'd taken on that night. They drove around Innisfail to the locations Calanca had mentioned, dropping off his neighbour and buying the torch, and then they drove to the bridge halfway to Tully that Calanca said he'd stopped at to turn back home after it had started raining. When police officers had finished following the route that he claimed he'd taken, they had travelled for a total of about 61 kilometres, or about 38 miles, a far cry from the 119 kilometres that had been clocked in the rental vehicle. Calanca had travelled almost double that distance on the night that Gabriel Meyer had disappeared. This was a glaring hole in Calanca's story. Where else had he been that night? He'd been adamant that he was willing to speak to police and to help in any way he could, but this was an obvious lie, and detectives were now more certain than ever that Damon Calanca had something to do with Gabriel Meyer's disappearance. They had seized the vehicle from the rental company for forensic analysis, but nothing could tie this vehicle to Gabe in any way. There were none of Gabe's fingerprints, no hair, no DNA, and no fibres that might have been matched to clothing that Gabe had owned or had been wearing. On the same day that Doug and Sherrie Meyer filmed their plea for information on Gabe, the 14th of January, Fawn Meyer placed a call to Damon Calanca. She was in tears, and she had a terrible feeling that he had something to do with Gabe going missing. She asked him where her brother was, and he told her that he didn't know, but he thought something terrible had happened to him. Fawn could tell that he was lying, and in that instant she somehow knew that Gabriel was dead, and that the man on the other end of the phone, the man that claimed to love her and miss her so much it hurt, had probably been the one to kill him, all in some twisted scheme to get her back to Australia or as revenge for rejecting him. Damon went on to tell Fawn that even his flatmates heard Gabe say that he was going swimming, and he was worried that perhaps he'd gotten attacked by a crocodile. Even though police had a strong feeling that Damon Calanca had somehow been involved, they had no evidence to prove it, and to confuse things even further, Damon Calanca's flatmates confirmed to police that they had heard Gabe say he was going swimming when he left the apartment. They had left to go out to a movie shortly after Gabe had gone and arrived home just before Calanca had returned from his drive halfway to Tully at about 9 p.m. Police now had witnesses that had confirmed that Gabe had intended to go swimming, and they had no physical evidence at all that Calanca had done anything to Gabriel. Fawn's gut feeling and the detective's intuition that Calanca was far more involved than he was letting on was not evidence. And apart from the discrepancy in the distance travelled in the ute, there was really no other indication or physical evidence that Calanca had done anything wrong. Officers spoke to Calanca's neighbour, Narinder Singh, who was also interviewed. He told police that he saw Calanca at around 7 in the back car park of the unit block that they both lived in near the ute that he had hired, which already had the roll of carpet in the back. Narinder Singh then saw Calanca again about 15 minutes later standing outside of his apartment and noticed that he looked a bit out of breath. Singh called out to him and asked if he could get a ride up to the local hotel so that he could cash his paycheck, and Calanca agreed, but said that he had a couple of other things to do first. At about 7:30, Calanca drove Singh to the hotel and dropped him back off at the unit block afterwards. It was about 8 p.m. by the time they got back, and Calanca told him that he was going to head up to Tully to drop off the carpet that was in the back of the ute. A witness had also come forward to police to say that they had seen someone matching Gabriel's description walking past a nearby shop in the direction of the Johnstone River. The shop was a few blocks away from Calanca's flat, and the witness had stated that he had seen this person shortly after the time that Calanca said Gabe had left his place. These witness statements seemed to corroborate what Calanca had told police, and it seemed to investigators that maybe Calanca's story checked out. They felt like he was still involved in some way though, and decided to continue surveillance of him to see if he went anywhere or did anything that might implicate him in any way. But they conceded that maybe they were looking in the wrong place. This was only strengthened when on Tuesday the 19th of January a canvas bag that was identified as Gabriel's was found on the banks of the Johnstone River. Police, detectives and Gabe's parents had been certain that Gabe knew the risks of swimming in the river and wouldn't have done so, especially while it was raining and dark, and they now had to doubt that belief. Sherrie Meyer said, quote, "Even though we were as certain as we could be that Gabe wouldn't have willingly gone and swam in the river, sometimes you sort of second guess yourself. You know, did he do something really stupid?" The local newspaper, the Innisfail Advocate, published the finding of Gabe's bag and the location where it had been found, and this prompted more witnesses to come forward. 2 young people came forward to police and told them that they had seen items of clothing on the pontoon on the night of January 12th at about 7 to 7:30 p.m. Another witness stated to police that they had seen someone on the pontoon that night throwing things into the river. The case was becoming more confusing to investigators. Had Gabriel placed his shoes and clothes on the pontoon and gone swimming in the river, knowing the dangers and the risk he was taking by doing so? Or had someone else placed those items there and then come back to scatter them in the river to throw police off what might have really happened to Gabe? Police tried to identify the young man that had been seen throwing items into the river, but they weren't able to figure out who it might have been, or why they'd been throwing what could have been important evidence into the water. On Wednesday the 20th of January 1993, police divers were called in to scour the Johnstone River for any evidence that might have been in the water. Doug and Sherrie Meyer weren't sure whether they wanted the divers to find anything or not, but they were desperate to find out what had happened to their son. Divers used explosive charges to scare away any crocodiles that might have been in the area where they were searching, and then they entered the dark, murky water of the river. There was zero visibility in the water, and divers had to conduct grid searches simply by touch alone. The divers had only been in the river for a few minutes when one of them surfaced and handed something to the search observer. It was a wristwatch. Police called Gabe's parents to come down and let them know if it had belonged to Gabriel. They confirmed that yes, it was Gabe's watch, and the discovery broke them. If his watch had been in the water, then Gabe had been too. And they knew then that Gabe was dead, in whatever way it had happened, whether it had been drowning or a crocodile attack or some other means. They knew that they would never see their son alive again. Detective Inspector Stan Kruger had joined the investigation team by the time the divers had found Gabe's watch in the Johnstone River. When the watch was inspected, Kruger realized that foul play had to have been involved. It was a diver's watch and had a double clip, which told him 2 things. 1, that Gabe wouldn't have needed to remove it to go swimming. Gabe loved the water, which is why he'd had a diver's watch, and he wouldn't take it off if he was going swimming. And 2, that it would have been nearly impossible for the watch to have fallen off his wrists. The clips had not been damaged, and apart from some scuffing on the glass of the watch face, there was no other damage and no damage to the straps. While police knew that someone or a couple of people had been seen throwing clothing into the river, the watch raised even more suspicion because it had clearly been removed from Gabe's wrist, and he would not have been the one to do it. Someone had done something to Gabriel Meyer, and the only person who had anything to gain by anything happening to him was Damon Calanca. Could Calanca have been the one to throw the watch into the water under the guise of going fishing that night? Police thought he knew more than he was telling them, and they didn't have any physical evidence, and they needed to keep an open mind, but they still knew that he was involved. Kruger contacted Fawn Meyer in America and asked her if she would be willing to call Calanca again and see if he would tell her anything that might help in the search. If he had nothing to do with Gabe disappearing, maybe he knew who might have been involved. Fawn agreed and called Damon Calanca and told him that she would not be coming home until she found out what had happened to her brother. Police hoped that this might prompt Calanca to take action and they would be able to follow him. But he denied knowing anything about what had happened to Gabe, and he also realized that he was being watched, which threw a wrench into the detectives' plans. Police weren't sure where to turn next, but they didn't have to think about it for too long. They received a call from a man named James Potter, who was not Harry Potter's dad, but just a friend of Damon Calanca's. He reported that about 2 weeks before Gabriel Meyer went missing, Calanca had taken him to the rainforest near Polly Creek, a local swimming hole. Calanca had taken him into the thick rainforest until they'd come to a clearing, and then Calanca had grabbed 2 large branches and marked a piece of the land with a cross. Potter thought that this behaviour was very strange, but Calanca had told him that he just wanted to make sure that he would be able to find the place again the next time he went camping. Before they had left the clearing, Calanca asked Potter if he could borrow a shovel. Police took James Potter back to the location that he'd gone with Damon Calanca. He showed them where they had walked and the area in which Calanca had marked. And there, under some palm leaves, police and detectives found what could only be described as a grave-sized hole. Kruger said, quote, "When you first see the hole, it's just nothing else but a grave. The shape of it, the depth of it, there was no doubt in my mind that this was to be someone's grave." Nearby, they also found 2 similar but smaller holes dug in the same way, long and deep. When this information was shared with Doug and Sherrie Meyer, they were horrified at the thought that maybe Gabe wasn't the only one of the Meyer children who was a target. Police decided that it was time to bring Damon Calanca in for another interview. They hoped that when confronted with the finding of the shallow grave in the rainforest, that Calanca would tell them what they needed to know. He was asked if he knew James Potter, and when he said he did, he was asked about the last time that he'd gone to Polly Creek with Potter. Calanca confirmed it was about 3 weeks earlier. Detectives asked if he had marked a spot there in the rainforest, and he said he had, just so he would remember where to go the next time he went up there. When asked if he'd been back since going with Potter, he said he hadn't. Before police could ask any further questions, however, Damon Calanca asked for the interview to be stopped so that he could call and hire a lawyer. After conferring with his lawyer, Calanca agreed to continue the interview. He then tried to explain to police why he dug the hole. He told investigators that he'd dug the 7-foot-long, 2-foot-deep hole so that he could grow some marijuana plants, so that he could sell some weed and make a bit of extra cash. Detectives knew that the conditions in the rainforest would have been terrible to grow plants, and when they had previously asked Calanca if he used any drugs, he had said that he didn't. He'd never been involved in drug use or selling before, and this was confirmed by the questioning of his flatmates and friends of his. Plus the fact that there was no way that he needed to dig a grave-sized hole to be able to plant marijuana in any case. It struck police as odd that he would just all of a sudden turn to growing and selling pot. It was possible, but it was highly unlikely. He was then asked if he'd gone up to Polly Creek in the hired ute the night Gabe had disappeared, and he said that he didn't. He had been planning on going up there the following morning, but when Gabe's dad Doug had turned up on his doorstep, he'd panicked and decided not to go. He told police that after he found out that Gabe was missing, he'd decided that he was, quote, "getting rid of the ute, That way I've got no hassles with the police. Which is weird. Why would he have hassles with the police about the vehicle if he'd never gone up to the creek in it? He told police that the reason why he was coming clean with them now about the plan to grow and sell drugs was because he didn't want to lie to them. He didn't, quote, want to put any smoke screens up. Because, he said, you only get yourself caught in trouble if you keep trying to tell stories. Police asked Calanca what he thought of the rumour that he had killed Gabriel to get Fawn to come back to Australia. He brushed this off by telling them that when he'd spoken to Fawn on the phone earlier that week, he'd even said to her that if she thought he'd done that just to get her to come back to Australia, well, she would have eventually gone back to America anyway, so there would have been no point in it. He told them he couldn't see the thinking behind that rumour because he loved the Meyer family a lot, and that he had no intention of hurting anybody. He said that he just simply would never do anything like that. Except that he had done something like that. He had stabbed a man because he wanted that man's girlfriend. So, like, cool story, bro. Detectives asked Damon Calanca in his opinion what he thought had happened to Gabriel. Calanca said that he thought Gabe was gone, that he'd taken off. When asked why, he said that it was just a feeling he'd gotten from some of the things that Gabe had said and done, that Gabe was very adventurous and that if he wanted to do something, then he would do it. He went on to say that he thought Gabe was sitting somewhere now, probably having the time of his life because that's what he wanted to do. Calanca didn't stop there. He continued by saying that he was actually really angry at Gabriel because he was now being investigated for what was most likely Gabe just running off somewhere. But, he said, if Gabe came back, he'd probably still try and be nice to him. He just didn't want to be blamed for something. He didn't want to be put in jail and then in 10 years' time Gabe turns up somewhere with his wife or something. That, he said, would be very upsetting to him. Detective Kruger felt like Damon Calanca was playing a game with them. He said, quote, it was like a challenge to him. He seemed to be enjoying talking to us. He knew what we had and what we didn't have, and I got the distinct feeling that he was enjoying every minute of it. Police knew that they needed to find Gabriel's body. They had some circumstantial evidence that pointed to Calanca, as well as his bogus stories about growing pot and going night fishing, but without a body, they weren't going to be able to go much further. It was the 26th of January, 2 weeks after Gabe disappeared, when they received a call that would break the case wide open. Sergeant Carrie Benstead took a call from a woman named Margaret Carmichael, who lived in a farming suburb called Moresby Creek on the outskirts of Innisfail. She told Benstead that she had smelt something awful on her cane farm the previous evening when she'd been out on her walk. She told him that she thought it smelt like a dead pig, that she hoped it was a dead pig. Feral pigs, or bush pigs as they're commonly known, frequently get into cane fields to feed on the sugar cane. She had gone to take another look when the sun had come up, and when she'd returned to where she had smelt the offending odour the previous night, she saw a mound of freshly dug earth. She was concerned that it was something far more sinister than a dead feral animal. Investigators went to the site and they began to move the soil. Under this mound of soil was a human body, lying stomach down, with its feet bound and its hand tied behind its back. It had been wrapped in a blanket, and then twine had been tied around the blanket, keeping it secure. When the body was finally fully uncovered and the blanket had been removed, it was formally identified as 17-year-old Gabriel Meyer. His body was taken to the morgue for a post-mortem, and Margaret Carmichael, the woman who had reported the discovery, was interviewed by detectives. She told police that on the 12th of January, the night Gabe had disappeared, she had seen headlights in the evening, coming off the highway and travelling through the back roads to near where Gabe's body had been found. She had thought nothing of it at the time because nothing had indicated they should be on the lookout for a body, and she had no idea that it had been there. She then told police that she had seen someone on a bike going from that area the day before she had called police. When they asked her if she knew who that person was, she said she did. It was Damon Calanca. She was asked if she was sure, and she told them there was no doubt in her mind that it was him. She knew him well. His parents lived next door to her. He was raised there and was intimately familiar with the area and had frequently gone fishing only meters from where the gravesite had been. The post-mortem on Gabriel Meyer did not show any overt injuries, no stab wounds, no gunshots, no ligature marks, and so the detectives had to wait until a full toxicology had been completed. But they were able to obtain a number of pieces of physical evidence, such as the rope used to bind the hands and feet and the blanket that the body had been wrapped up in. On Friday the 29th of January, pictures of the blanket were circulated through media outlets in the hopes that someone might recognize it. And someone did. Damon Calanca's ex-wife contacted police to say that she had seen the blanket on television and that it was the same one that they had owned when they had lived together. The rope that had been obtained, according to Damon Calanca's flatmates, was also consistent with rope that Calanca's flatmate had owned, but it had mysteriously gone missing a couple of weeks beforehand. The blanket that had been used to wrap Gabe in was tested by forensic units who found 6 polypropylene fibers that did not match the blanket itself. What they did match, though, was the old, worn, stained carpet that Calanca had claimed he was dropping off to his sister the night Gabe went missing. Police now knew, without a doubt, that Damon Calanca had been involved in the murder of Gabriel Meyer. They were still waiting on the toxicology report, but due to the lack of injuries on Gabriel's body, they suspected that he may have been poisoned. They thought back to the initial interview that they had with Calanca. He had told them that when Gabe had come to his flat, he had given Gabriel a protein drink called Sustagen. He had told them that he'd mentioned this supplement to Gabe at the gym, and when Gabe had come back to the flat, he'd asked Calanca if he would give him some. Calanca had mixed the powdered supplement with milk and given it to Gabriel. He had also stressed the point with police that there was nothing wrong with what he had given Gabriel, that he'd only just bought it and he hadn't even unsealed the container before Gabe had come over that afternoon. At that time, there was nothing more to read into with that, but they now wondered whether Calanca had laced the drink with something that could have killed Gabriel. When the results from toxicology finally came back, they had the answer. In Gabe's liver and stomach contents, forensic officers found paracetamol, pseudoephedrine, chlorpheniramine, and metoclopramide. The reports showed an extremely high level of all of them in the tissues of Gabriel's body, which meant that he had ingested an exceptionally large quantity of these drugs. Detectives knew that the most common forms of medication that had all of these ingredients were cold and flu medications, but the amounts in his system meant that he had effectively overdosed on them. They were only able to confirm how much was left in his system, not how much he had taken or how much had been initially absorbed. But Professor Olaf Drummer from the Victorian Institute of Forensic Medicine stated that if given enough, it may have killed him, but more likely than that, it had been enough to make him extremely drowsy, putting him to sleep or rendering him unconscious, where he would have been unable to fight off an attacker. It was clear to the forensics team after the postmortem and toxicology that Gabriel had been drugged and then suffocated or asphyxiated. During the postmortem examination, there was one other piece of evidence that confirmed this conclusion: a small piece of thin plastic that had been stuck to his face. It had a very distinct and unusual shape, and anyone who remembers the days of single-use plastics would instantly recognize it. It was a small piece of a plastic grocery bag. Detectives now had enough circumstantial and physical evidence to make a charge, and on the 1st of February 1993, they arrested Damon Frank Calanca for the murder of Gabriel Meyer. But Damon Calanca was not about to give in. He flat out refused to speak with police again. He did, however, speak to his sister, Deborah Morton. Deborah attempted to get the truth out of Calanca. At first, he tried to deny that he had done anything at all to Gabriel Meyer, but the evidence was overwhelming. She told him, quote, "For once in your life, I want you to be a man and tell us the truth. The family needs to know." She also reminded him that he'd been nothing but a compulsive liar all of his life, and it was time to come clean. Deborah Morton said that at that point she could see her brother visibly trembling, and then he said 3 words: "I did it." She asked him why, and what he told her is probably gonna make you want to punch something really, really hard. He told her that he had killed Gabriel Meyer because Gabe had been coming on to him, that he had always been touching him at the gym, and that when he had come back to his flat, he'd continued to make advances towards him. Calanca said he got angry, he lost control, and he strangled him. Basically, he was trying to claim what was known as the gay panic defense, known in Australia at the time as the homosexual advance defense. Now, obviously, this defense is a bunch of bullshit, but all over the world in the mid-19th to 20th centuries, it was a legal strategy where the defendant would claim to have acted in a state of violent, temporary insanity, committing assault or murder because of unwanted same-sex sexual advances. They found the advances so offensive or frightening that they were provoked into reaction, were of diminished capacity, and were temporarily insane, only attacking in self-defense. Like I said, bullshit. It's actually scary that this was an actual allowable legal defense for murder. Thankfully, this defense is no longer available in any Australian jurisdiction, Victoria being the first state to repeal it almost 20 years ago. But sadly, in many other countries, it is still a valid legal defense. Sherrie Meyer, Gabe's mother, said at first the family was enraged that he would claim this defense. But as time went on, she realized that this was just a desperate attempt to remove blame from himself for his own actions. Damon Calanca argued that because of this defense, the most he could be charged with was manslaughter. The thing was, though, that police had actually spoken with Calanca regarding this subject in their first ever interview with him. I have no idea what relevance it had at all, but they had asked him if he knew if Gabe had ever had relationships with other men, and Calanca had said no, that he had never seen or heard or been told anything that would ever make him think that Gabriel had been gay. And then, of course, he made sure that detectives knew that he wasn't gay either. But now he was claiming that he needlessly and senselessly killed a 17-year-old boy because he'd been making unwanted advances towards him. Officers knew that they needed to prove intent. They knew that not even a year and a half beforehand, Calanca had got away with attempted murder because he claimed he had attacked Paul Mellick in the heat of the moment, that it had been an emotional response, just like his attack and murder of Gabriel, and detectives were not about to let this happen again. They knew that they could use the holes dug in Polly Creek as evidence. The shallow grave that Gabriel had been found in had been the exact same size and depths as the holes that Calanca had dug in the clearing in the rainforest. It seemed to investigators that he had initially planned to take Gabe into the forest on some false pretense, and so had dug that hole in anticipation of the murder. But he had not counted on the fact that the medication that he had slipped Gabriel in the protein drink had been too strong. They would have had to walk into the forest to get to the clearing, which would not have been possible for Gabe after he'd been rendered unconscious from the drugs. Damon Calanca had been forced to take Gabe rolled up in the blanket and the carpet to another site, one that was more easily accessible. While Calanca's sister was getting a confession from him, detectives were still working on strengthening the case against him. They approached the pharmacies and chemists in the Innisfail area to get records of purchases that Calanca may have made leading up to Gabriel's death. One of the local pharmacies had a record of Damon Calanca making a purchase. He had bought cold and flu and anti-vomiting medication, of which the active ingredients exactly matched the results of Gabriel Meyer's toxicology report. He had made this purchase on the 6th of January, almost a week before Gabe had been killed, and exactly 1 day after Fawn had told him that their relationship was over. It was the final nail in the coffin for Damon Calanca. This was not a crime committed in the heat of the moment. This was a carefully calculated murder that he had been planning and preparing since Fawn told him that she wasn't coming back. He was so obsessive that he remembered the only reason she said she would ever come back: if something happened to her family, and so he made sure that something did. He killed her 17-year-old brother. Damon Calanca went on trial for murder in 1994. He had hoped to have his charge downgraded to manslaughter and receive a lighter punishment, but the prosecution proved beyond a reasonable doubt that he had been planning this murder for at least a week before he had killed Gabriel Meyer. He had a history of obsessive behavior towards the women he dated, and had shown that he was capable of violence. Piecing together the witness statements and physical evidence, prosecutors stated that Gabe Meyer had come back to Calanca's flat after the gym and had left shortly before Calanca's flatmates had gone to the movies to go for a swim, but had returned shortly after, realizing that it was raining and that the conditions were too dangerous to swim in the river. When he had returned, Calanca had made him a protein drink laced with at least 14 head clear tablets, 7 times the recommended dosage, and an undetermined amount of Maxilon anti-vomiting pills which contained high levels of metoclopramide. Gabriel would have been unconscious within 45 minutes, which meant that there would have been plenty of time for Calanca to change his mind. He could have stopped at any time, but instead he sat there, watching Gabe get drowsy, fall asleep, and eventually pass out. He then bound Gabriel's hands and feet behind him and put a plastic bag around his head until Gabriel died of suffocation. He got out the blanket and wrapped Gabriel's body in it before securing the blanket with more rope. He hid the body in the roll of carpet and carried it out to the rented ute and placed it in the tray. When his neighbour, Narinder Singh, called out for a ride to the local hotel, Calanca told him he would give him a lift in about 15 minutes. He went down to the pontoon, placed Gabriel's clothing, shoes, and his canvas backpack there, and threw Gabe's watch into the water. He then returned to the unit block and took Singh to the local hotel, all the while knowing that his 17-year-old murder victim was in the back of the car. He then dropped Singh back off and told him that he was going out to Tully, but instead of Tully, he headed to the cane farm, the one he knew so well because he'd lived next door to it for so long. He had dropped Gabe's body off as quickly as he could and rushed back to his flat so that he would be home when his flatmates returned from the movies, allowing him to use this as an alibi. After they had gone to bed, he got back in the vehicle and went to the store where he bought the torch and batteries, and then he headed back to the farm. Using the shovel that he'd borrowed from James Potter, he dug the shallow grave. He placed Gabriel's body in it and covered it with dirt before heading back home. Detectives and prosecutors knew that he'd gone out to the farm twice because of the discrepancy on the odometer in the rental car. Detectives had retraced these routes, taking the neighbour to the hotel and back, going to buy the torch and batteries, making 2 trips to the farm, and the distance they calculated was about 119 kilometres, the same amount that Calanca had clocked on the rental that night. This was a highly narcissistic man who could not accept rejection. He was so enraged that he'd been denied the relationship that he wanted with Fawn, and begging and pleading with her hadn't worked. So he decided, whether in an effort to bring her back to Australia or some sort of sick revenge, that he would murder an innocent teenager. Gabriel was a beautiful, kind-hearted, fun-loving young man who meant so much to so many people, who was taken from his family, his friends, and the endless possibilities of a boy on the verge of adulthood, all because Damon Calanca valued his own inflated sense of entitlement over the life of another person. After a 5-hour deliberation on Friday the 11th of February 1994, Calanca was found guilty of murder. Damon Frank Calanca was given a mandatory life sentence, and the judge also made a statement warning the parole board that they should be very careful in considering any future application. Sherrie and Doug Meyer will never fully recover from the murder of their son. When Gabe went missing and when his body was subsequently found, they were confused, they were scared, but most of all, they were at a loss as to what they were supposed to do. They had 5 other children, and though the police were doing everything they could to solve the case, they were left with very little guidance and no direction as to how to cope with the loss of their son and the fact that he had been murdered. Sherrie said, quote, "The police were wonderful, but the police are so busy. Without any support, without information, families were kind of left to fend for themselves." She remembered the police finding Gabe's body and immediately taking it for autopsy, and she had no idea if her and her husband were supposed to be there for that or what happens after that. In 1995, the year after their son's murder, Doug and Sherrie Meyer helped found the Queensland Homicide Victims Support Group, or QHVSG. Now, within 48 hours of a homicide, a specially trained peer support worker will come to help the family, with not only the awful practical side of things like dealing with police and organising funerals, but also to offer endless and valuable emotional support. Each support worker has their own personal experience with homicide, and so are better able to understand the anger, the frustration, the pain, and most of all the hollow feeling of loss that is felt by the surviving family. They created the support network so that no other family had to feel as lost and as alone as she and Doug had felt when they learnt their son had been murdered. Her pain, loss, and suffering gave rise to an incredible organisation that continues to support families even now, 26 years on. 16 years after Damon Calanca was sent to prison in May of 2010, he made his first application for parole. The parole board considered the application for almost a year before denying it in April of 2011. He requested a review of the decision, and it was again refused in February of 2012. He applied for parole at every opportunity. In August of 2012, he again applied, but the board ruled that he posed an unacceptable risk to the community and sent him a document outlining their concerns. He addressed these in a 5-page submission in October of 2012, but in November, parole was again denied. The next parole application was made in February of 2014 and was refused in May of the following year. He continued to request reviews of the parole board's decisioning. The parole board agreed to a review of his rejection on the grounds that he was examined by psychologists. A number of assessments were made by different doctors, all who had differing opinions of his likelihood of reoffending. Some said that he'd been a model inmate who had taken responsibility for what he had done and was well rehabilitated, and that he would pose a minimal risk in the community and should be considered for parole under supervision with regular drug testing and counselling. Others, however, argued that his 2 violent offences, the attack on Paul Mellick and the murder of Gabriel Meyer, were both against males who were in close relationships with females that were seen to reject him. The parole report states, quote, "It should be noted that Mr. Calanca's extreme violent disposition appears to have only surfaced in response to being rejected by girlfriends. Hence, Mr. Calanca's relapse prevention strategies remain untested. In the past, he was extremely revengeful and planful, and he did not hesitate to use violence if he felt his relationships were threatened. There is no doubt that he has matured over the last 22 years, and he appears confident that he can deal with difficult relationship issues. He certainly has more skills to handle the issues of rejection now than he did some 22 years ago at the age of 25, but whether he will use these skills in the future remains to be seen. Basically, yeah, he's been a good boy because he's in prison and wants to get out, but there's no telling what would happen if he did get out and was rejected by another woman. This application for parole was eventually also denied. His next application was made in February of 2017. He'd now been part of a work release program, internal prison work and community programs, had been allowed day leave, had a home and supervisor organised, and was certain that he had done everything he could to mitigate what the parole board considered an unacceptable risk to the community. In October of that year, his fifth parole application was denied, and in a review requested by Calanca in February of 2018, the rejection was upheld. An excerpt from the letter sent to Calanca from the parole board reads, "The board also considered your submission that you would adhere to a potential condition of your parole order preventing you from entering into intimate relationships. The board also noted your submission whereby you state you would discuss, quote, any issues that may arise in my life with a board-approved psychiatrist or psychologist that you would see regularly. The board is not convinced by your submission, specifically having regard to the fact that you were subject to a community-based order at the time of committing the offence of murder." The report went on to say that the board wasn't satisfied that Calanca's self-reporting was in any way an effective means of monitoring his behaviour while on parole. Gabriel Meyer's parents attended every parole hearing and have fought to make their voices heard about the danger that Damon Calanca represents. They feel like he will be a direct threat to them if he was ever to be released. When Damon Calanca received his fifth rejection for parole, he went a step further, and in February of 2019, he submitted a request for review to the Supreme Court. To almost everyone's, especially the Meyer family's horror, after 26 years in prison, Damon Calanca's parole was approved, and he was released on the 14th of February 2020. He lives in Toowoomba under constant supervision. I cannot help but be scared for the next woman that he decides he loves, and her family. Sherrie Meyer spoke to the ABC after learning that Calanca had been granted parole. So 26 years on for us, another period of grief, fear, having to put that back into our lives now that the perpetrator that killed our beautiful young boy is now walking the street. She feels like he's still a dangerous criminal, but she's glad that the homicide support group is there for all of them, even now. But that's it. That is the case of the tragic murder of Gabriel Meyer and the POS that is Damon Frank Calanca, now a 54-year-old parolee able to go and live the rest of his life, while Gabriel will never reach adulthood, will never celebrate another birthday or Christmas. He'll never see his siblings grow up, but he will always be remembered and loved. And I will be back with more Australian true crime, but until then, be good, be safe, and don't murder anyone. Bye.